Today, we are joined by Dr. Miri Bar-Halpern, clinical instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School and director of trauma training and services at Parents for Peace. Some of you may recognize Dr. Bar-Halpern, who I will call Miri going forward, because she testified before the Massachusetts Special Commission on Combating Antisemitism. And it was an opportunity for us on the commission to really think about child trauma and the work of dealing with trauma in a school setting and outside of school setting, and how kids are experiencing the world after October 7th, how schools, parents, teachers, leaders can do better in meeting the needs of kids. And so we wanted to really unpack some of that and explore it further with Miri, and she's been very generous with her time coming in to join us today. So let me back up a little bit and ask you first, how did you first become interested in the topic of child trauma?
So growing up in Israel, I grew up during the Second Intifada. So terrorist attack was definitely part of my life. I knew people who were injured or killed. And also my dad is a psychiatrist who his specialty is treating Holocaust survivors and second generation. So if I didn't have it outside of the house, I had it in the house as well. So I always knew I wanted to be a psychologist. And then it was just a perfect match to help victims of trauma. And then I met my husband here in the US, and his father is a victim of 9/11. And that also kind of emphasized my specific niche of helping victims of terrorism.
I want to start with some work that you did as part of your doctorate.
Sure.
And I think it was very interesting. And with regular followers of JCRC, you know, the topic of superheroes is a minor obsession to me. So I was very struck by the title of your book, Becoming a Superhero. And I know that there's a story behind the writing of this book and the publication of this book.
This book is part of my dissertation, so part of my doctorate. And I decided to look at evidence-based books and as a way of therapy, bibliotherapy. And what I realized is that a lot of books are great in telling the story, but they don't have evidence-based intervention in the story. Mm-hmm. So I combined one passion, which is writing, with another passion, which is therapy, and created this journey of the dog. He's basically growing up in an environment where there is constant alarm and booms and terrorism. And he asks his mom, what can I do? How can we fight the bad guys? And he goes on this journey to find a hero. And of course, at the end, he realizes that he's the hero. But throughout the book, there's a lot of interventions, and he talks to parents and for the kids. So interestingly enough, I wrote a book in English, part of my dissertation, and it was published in Israel as part of helping kids in the South. And then a few years later, I was trying to publish it here in the US, and I was told there is no terrorist attack in the US. That was right before the Boston Marathon. So they asked me to change the title of the book, which was, the original title is Becoming a Superhero, a book for children who experience terrorism, to a book for children who experience trauma, to make it more general.
I'm struck by the Hebrew version of this, Li'ot Gibor Al, what you just said about children hearing the booms. And I'm thinking this is a little bit off of the topic of trauma, but it's also about how we transmit knowledge to children. During the discussion here in Boston or in Massachusetts about adopting a genocide education mandate a few years back, I happened to be at Yad Vashem with a bunch of ministers from Massachusetts, and they asked an educator at Yad Vashem, they were really interested in how do you teach children about the Holocaust? And it was a fascinating conversation, but one of the points that the educators at Yad Vashem made was that in Israel, every child, even before they're verbal, experiences Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, and Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, because of the sirens. And so by the time they're at the place of, mommy, daddy, what is the siren about? They've already grown up with the siren. It is already part of the DNA of the society. And I'm curious, I mentioned that both because of what you said about they hear the booms, you grow up with the booms. There's a different relationship to terrorism as a word, and not just trauma, which was the English version, but also like your point about before the Boston Marathon, maybe we were a bit inured to the idea of terrorism as a thing we experience here, even though that was, to be blunt about it, only a decade after 9/11. There were obviously other terrorist incidents in the United States during that period. So I'm curious how you think about sort of child exposure to these issues. What is the appropriate age and how to bring them along in understanding trauma in a society?
Well, with younger kids, I would work mostly with parents. It's a lot of parent coaching and having the parents be the secure base to really help the kid. And as they get older, you want to change the language you're talking and also limit the exposure to adapt to whatever developmental age they're in. To your point about Israel specific, we did grow up with that. It was part of the narrative. So the conversation are a bit different, especially now when kids are it's still a war zone, right? I mean, it's a continuous traumatic response. There's still people that say, we don't have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because we're still in it. In fact, only when I moved here, so I moved here when I was about 25 for my doctorate, I remember we went to a party with my colleague from school, and it was Connecticut. Everything shuts down around like 1:00. My instinct when everything shut down and the light went up was to take cover. And only then I realized that, the way I grew up was abnormal for the rest of the world. It was normal for me. When I entered a bus in Israel, it was a check. Is there a bomb there? When I enter the mall, someone is checking my car to see if I have any bomb in my back seat. And here, when I go to places, I'm like opening my bag and people think I'm crazy.
I will say, as someone who brings civic leaders to Israel for actually now going on about 3+ years, one of the things we often do, like in orientation, is preparing them for what they will experience in a society in terms of security. Like to your point of like, when we go into a mall, your bag is going to be searched. Those things were far more disconcerting 10 or 15 years ago for them. And as I think American society has become much more attuned to the security threats, the realities of these things, and as we've seen more and more, not at the level that Israel has, more and more of that kind of like screening security in public space here, we've had to do less orientation around it.
Interesting.
It's been a shift. You mentioned you did your doctorate before the Boston Marathon bombing. So you've been working on child trauma for a fairly long time. So I want to talk about the work before October 7th, what you were working on, what you were seeing, what you were observing, and how you were thinking about interventions.
My specific area is evidence-based intervention for emotion regulation for trauma, self-harm, suicidality. So I dedicated my career to that. So from starting grad school, I worked in the school system. Then I worked in long-term residential facility, then a psychiatric hospital, DCF facilities, McLean Hospital, residential over there. So I really tried to understand trauma from different systems, different levels of care to be able to adapt to what's needed. And then in the last several years, I've been working in Boston Child Study Center as a director of intensive outpatient and seeing very similar population, only in the outpatient world. I did that so I can really fit whatever I'm doing to the kids in front of me. The previous work was with victims. So anything from sexual abuse, neglect, car accident, life-threatening situation, anything that's under the category of either acute stress or prolonged stress. I do a lot of training in Israel, in Gea Hospital, and some in Schneider, and a lot of different areas. And this is where I worked most closely with people who were either affected by war or terrorism and trained the staff over there. And then October 7th happened. Not growing up here, I heard about anti-Semitism from my grandparents. October 7th was a shock. October 8th was worse. So October 7th, I did something which I think till this day, my husband thinks it was crazy. I wrote down in the Israeli Facebook group, this is my cell phone number. If anybody needs support, call me. And a lot of people called that I've never met in my life. That was October 7th. And I remember I was trying to still understand what's happening. I was with my kids. I get all those phone calls of people crying and here, not from Israel, are in a state of panic and trauma. So we're talking about indirect exposure, but they feel it. I felt it as if I was there because it could have been my family. And it's still, a few hours into it, we didn't know what was going on. So then that led to a whole new initiative with other psychologists and social workers, Israelis from the area. And we created a group that would just support the Israeli immigrants in Massachusetts. And we provided free one-on-one support, groups, seminars, webinar. If there was a need, we would be there. And we did it for over a year. Had hundreds of conversations with people. And I started noticing that I feel more fulfilled and in the right place doing this type of work, helping the community, than my other type of work where I felt very alone. But I've noticed consultation team with my colleagues were not the same. Seminars were not the same. There's a lot of aboutism. And I was that Jew who constantly talk about, hey, don't forget to check in with your Jewish clients about anti-Semitism or what's happening on the 7th. And a lot of time it was met with, don't forget to check also about Islamophobia and what about the Palestinian children? And my point was never, this is not instead. We are in a state of trauma. And for me, I'm the only Israeli in my office in the clinic. I felt like I'm living in a different reality from my colleague, noticing what's happening from trauma perspective, but also from the responses of the community led me to realize that we're experiencing something that I'm actually familiar with from my work with trauma, which is traumatic invalidation. So traumatic invalidation is a term that was talked about in dialectical behavioral therapy by Marshall Linehan, Martin Boas, Melanie Hernay did a ton of work around it with minorities, but not with Jewish people because, a lot of people don't think we're a minority. And Jewish people meet every one of the criteria for traumatic invalidation. And I start collecting those stories from the people I've been seeing since October 7th, where the constant fear, where they have this insecurity. People don't get me. People gaslight me. People tell me that I'm wrong, that I'm not supposed to feel this way. People are telling me that, yes, you're hurt, but hey, what about the other side? So when you take someone who experienced trauma, let's say if I was sexually assaulted and I'm coming out and I'm telling my parents, someone hurt me, and their response is, it's the way you were dressed.
Right.
That's invalidation. And I think that's what Jewish people are experiencing today since October 7th.
I want to help people sort of understand in practice what you're seeing and working with and sort of what that intervention actually looks like.
There is this new term in therapy that doesn't have a lot of evidence behind it. It's not scientific. It's called decolonization therapy, which is basically mean that therapists should bring their political agenda into the room, and actually places in Massachusetts and other around the US, the therapists told our clients to go protest with them against Israel. So this is not a good example.
Okay.
And
maybe we want to talk more about there's been some coverage of sort of what has gone on in the field of therapy and how clinical associations have tried to blackball Jewish, quote, Zionist psychologists, or certainly some stuff that's gone on in Chicago, or advocates at various seminars and conferences for psychologists that have said that Zionism is a pathology or is actually a clinical, problem.
One of the people I've seen through that volunteer work, she has a different therapist, and she felt like her therapist does not get it. She didn't understand her pain. And when she was trying to talk to her about how alone she feels and how every time she goes out and see the hostages poster ripped down, or, all the protests back then around Harvard, she feels that her, fight or flight freeze response is coming up, which basically means her heart is racing really fast, shakiness, she's constantly hypervigilant. Where is this coming from? Who's going to come and hit me or hurt me? Her therapist was giving her the impression that it's all in her head. She also gave me an example where a place here in Massachusetts, where she used to go for group therapy. It's an LGBTQ known place where she saw as her home. She used to go there for 2 years. After October 7th, all the art in that clinic changed to From the River to the Sea, with maps of Israel covered with the Palestinian flag. And
in the clinic.
And the leader of the group started wearing keffiyeh. This was a few weeks after October 7th. Now, this specific patient that I've seen, she lost people on October 7th at the Nova Festival. So she tried to advocate, and she told the leader of the group, I don't feel safe. And the response was, I'm Jewish too. You're just going to need to get over it. And, we're going to agree to disagree about it. And she never went back to the group. She's
been gaslit, is told to get over it. Okay.
Exactly. There is this pervasive insecurity, that feeling of maybe I am crazy, maybe they're right. And there is a loss. There is the loss from Israel, and there is also a loss of what's happening here. She lost her community. So the first thing I did was to validate her experience and to give her the language. So actually saying what you're experiencing is traumatic invalidation. And I went over the different criterias and I asked her, which one do you feel that you're actually meeting? It's like this one, this one, this one. And then we started working on teaching her skills to regulate her emotion. So that's from dialectical behavioral therapy. So there is emotion regulation skills that people can use to regulate their body.
Can you give me like one example?
Sure.
Simple one.
So emotion regulation would be, for example, self-care. So what is under your control? What can you do today? I can get out of bed. I can decide to get dressed. I can take a bath. I can make myself a cup of coffee. So very small things to all the way to making a plan of today I'm going to go to the gym. Today I'm going to meet a friend. Anything that you think about self-care. For emotion regulation, though, you need to first identify what you're feeling. So giving her the language, when your heart is beating really, really fast and you're noticing that, your thoughts are just running in your head and you're noticing the shakiness, you're probably feeling anxiety. And then let's talk about what's anxiety like for you. What thoughts do you have when you feel anxiety? Someone is going to come and hurt me. Okay, let's look at that. In this specific scenario, when you're at home, do you feel safe? And what I started doing with Jewish clients and Israeli clients, I started noticing a difference between physically safe to psychologically safe. So she might be physically safe, but she might not be psychologically safe. So then we started limiting things that cause this feeling of unsafety, for example, social media.
Mm-hmm.
She took herself out of a lot of Facebook groups because of that, because she's noticing that every time she goes online or every time she sees any post from that LGBTQ clinic, her heart is racing again. Mm-hmm. And she feels all those triggers coming back up. So we start limiting those. And then we worked on the stress tolerance skill. That's another big one. So those, for example, when you're in the moment, when things are about to escalate, those are not long-term skills. Those are skills to just make sure that things are not worse. So that can be ice diving, like literally putting your head in a bucket of cold water and ice and not breathing. It mimics the diving reflex. So everything kind of slow down when you do that. Or just holding ice. Doing some 5 to 7 minutes of intense exercise can help because then the feel-good hormones are coming up. Progressive muscle relaxation, when you tense your muscles and then release them, tense and release them. And then diaphragmatic breathing. So actually taking air and breathing to the diaphragm is something that can be really helpful.
Okay.
So those are skills for herself. But then we worked on what can you do to change. So in dialectical behavioral therapy, we talk about that balance between change and acceptance. And we looked at what can you not change, and you're just going to need to accept even though you hate it. That's radical acceptance. I don't like it. There's nothing I can do about it, so I choose to accept it. Versus, I actually can make a difference and I can change. And then we wrote something that she can actually give to the people in the clinic. Did not work. So then I ended up talking with the director of the clinic.
And how did your conversation with the clinic go?
They were very defensive initially. If I remember correctly, the response was, I guess I can see it from both sides, because I showed them posts that they had. And I said, as a therapist, we're supposed to do no harm. You don't want to use evidence-based intervention, fine, but do no harm to your client. And when our client is telling you, I don't feel safe, and you're gaslighting them, I could report you to the board. So then they asked me what they think they should do. And I gave them my whole spiel of recommendation. I don't think they did any of that. So then we worked on radical acceptance. An example of true patients out of many that I've seen since October 7th that really share their trauma and their anxiety. So one of them is an Israeli immigrant. His brother is serving in the army. So obviously he's constantly worried about him. And then he moved here about a year or two ago to a community that has some Israelis in them. And, it's interesting because I've noticed that there's even more hate around those communities and other communities. And people started bullying him at school, said that his brother is a baby killer. He's been worrying about going to specific classes. Teachers have been mean would be an understatement. So really feeling bullying from all ends while being an immigrant. He started isolating, staying in his room more, really telling his parents he doesn't want to go to school. Ton of anxiety, started to self-harm as a way. So self-harm is a ineffective way of regulating emotions for a lot of people. This was what he said, it was the only thing that really helped him calm down because he would stay awake all night with thoughts. some of them about his brother, and he also knew people who were murdered on October 7th. But some of them are also, where's it going to come from tomorrow? Who's going to bully me at school? So he started self-harming and he disclosed some suicidal thoughts as well. And then the other story is a Jewish American girl who was very proudly Jewish, was wearing like a Star of David, would go to temple with her parents, celebrated all the holidays. And she's actually in a community with not a lot of Jewish people. And she, very similar, was bullied. She started hiding her necklace to the point of not wearing it, telling her, I met with her parents as well. They were sharing that she told them she does not want to be Jewish anymore. She did not want to go to temple because she felt that hate. And she didn't understand why there is so much hate. So it must be because I'm Jewish and I just don't want to be Jewish. And also a lot of anxiety, isolation. With her, there was also a huge change in her appetite. She stopped eating. Because when we think about trauma is a loss of top-down control, meaning from the brain down. And person who's been traumatized, they just want to have a sense of control. So self-harm is a way of gaining control, and not eating is a way of gaining control. With young kids, we see that they're trying to control the bowel movements. All of it is an effective way, but we don't know it. Obviously, the patients don't know it. And so we really see a lot of symptoms that I would say in my clinic with what we call the typical trauma clients.
So when we were at the commission meeting in January and you testified, folks in our community may be aware that there has been a consistent, organized effort to delegitimize the work of the commission. And there's been a group of folks that have been showing up at every commission meeting and sitting in the first couple of rows there to write reports about why this entire conversation that the Commission on Combating Antisemitism has just shouldn't even be happening. And after you spoke to the commission, I remember the hearing had ended and I saw you across the room go over and actually squat down in front of them and have a conversation. And I would love to hear about that conversation, which went on for quite a while. And you had been in front of the commission talking about child trauma, Israeli American immigrant children and their trauma post-October 7th. You were very clear about these approaches to trauma are in support of all communities and all kids. How did you engage these folks who are so determined to shut this conversation down?
When I saw that those two rows are, some of them were wearing keffiyeh, some of them were wearing Palestine earrings, some of them, it was very clear. They made a statement. And it was interesting to me because when I dressed up, I actually was very mindful of what I'm wearing because I'm entering the room from a trauma-informed lens. I didn't want to hurt anybody that might be watching it. So I have a, Free the Hostages shirt, and I chose not to wear it. And so it was very much in my face. And more than that, what they did during the hearing, when I started talking about Jewish trauma, they very loudly left the room. The two rows left the room, and only 3 people stayed in the front in a very dramatic way. So I had to stop and kind of look back. I didn't let it distract me. It was just, you're making my point that you do not care as a Jew about Jewish people's trauma. So I asked them, why are you here? This is a hearing about anti-Semitism and about trauma of kids. Why are you here, in a way, protesting by sitting there against it? And the conversation went to, well, we're representing Jewish voices. And then I asked them, okay, but that doesn't answer my question. And then one of them started telling me, well, I'm an anti-Zionist. And I went back to my point. This is about trauma. I'm not even engaging in conversation with you about anti-Semitism or Zionism or whatever you want to call it. You cannot respect Jewish people's trauma. Why did your colleagues leave the room when I was talking about it? And she goes, oh, no, they left because it was a really long day. So then my friend and boss she's Miriam Churchill, who is amazing. She is the head of Parents for Peace, which is an organization that I joined, and I can talk about it as well. She's Muslim, and she joined a conversation, and she came over to her and said, that's not what happened. I heard your friend telling you, I'm leaving because I can't hear it. That's too much. I don't want to hear that bullshit.
As a member of the commission, we could hear the person audibly say some very ugly things as she was leaving the room, worse than what you actually just reported and shared. I want to turn to so what you were there to actually talk about and your work with
When I speak about the Jewish community, I do think we need to separate the Jewish Israelis and then Jewish Americans, because Israelis immigrants facing more symptoms. Mm-hmm. They are immigrants, meaning they're not in the same place. They are not in their regular community and anything that an immigrant would go through, just the regular difficulties. But on top of that, their families and friends are still in a war zone. Mm. So their mind is constantly shifting between what's happening in Israel to what's happening here. And then what I've been seeing is that they've been criticized and blamed and bullied as they are representing the Israeli government. So at schools, it starts with swastikas, but it's not just that. That's the easy one to name, right? It's being called dirty Zionist. It's being called colonizer, white supremacist. You're a baby killer. And those are things that my patients were telling me, that their peers were telling them, and to stop inviting them to places. And at school, when
these are children,
those are K-12, social isolation, school avoidance, anxiety, sitting in class, and if they're learning about social justice or about history, some of them were shaking. Some of them were told, get out of the classroom because this is too much for you, or you cannot talk about this subject because you're biased. Some were literally called liars for bringing their own perspective as people who grew up in that area. So that's the Israeli immigrants. And then with the Jewish people as well. So when they're being bullied for something that is such a core part of their identity, you can't expect them to feel safe. It's like saying that if someone is part of the LGBTQ community and you're telling them, this part of your identity is not welcome here. It's a core part of someone's identity. So if you come with a shirt that has a Palestinian flag on the Israeli, instead of the Israeli flag on it, the message is your country that you feel part of does not have the right to exist, which means you do not have the right to exist. It's a threat. It's an existential threat. And when people are under these type of threats for a long period of time, and this has been a long period of time, they're going to have more symptoms. They're going to have more anxiety. I mean, I can go back to, we talk about evidence-based. Around the 80s, there was a study about adverse childhood experiences, and they showed that people who have more adverse childhood experiences throughout the years will have more mental health issues, substance abuse issues, medical issues, and actually would die earlier. What's been happening in the last year and a half, and I would argue that for a lot of Jews, which I wasn't aware of because of antisemitism, probably even before October 7th, has been adverse experiences, one on top of another one. And for me, when I think about trauma is a wound. It's a scar. It doesn't go away. And when you have another scar on top of a scar, it's really hard to heal.
Have there been successful interventions in creating a trauma-informed school environment after October 7th?
No.
What would a successful intervention look like?
There's the recognizing there is trauma, realizing the symptoms of trauma, making sure that there's no re-traumatization, right? And making the environment safe for everybody. Most places did not take a stand and said what happened is trauma. Or if they did, it was aboutism about it. There was no acknowledgement of this is awful. October 7th has changed the life of Jewish people around the world. There was no acknowledgement for a lot of places. And then when you're thinking about the trauma-informed environment, to feel safe is to feel seen. That do you get me? That if I'm having a hard time sitting in class right now, it's because my mind is wondering about my family in Israel or the hostages, or, there was just the returns of the bodies of the Bibas babies and their mother. One person who is not Jewish contacted me that day and asked me, are you okay? So back to your question, asking, are you okay? Is the physical environment safe? If you have from the river to the sea and it's triggering for someone, I don't care if you're going to argue with me if it's anti-Semitic or not. If I'm telling you I don't feel safe, that needs to be taken down. So no, to your question, I didn't see a lot of trauma-informed intervention happening. So Parents for Peace, I'll say a word about it.
Yes, tell us about Parents for Peace.
Sure, I love it.
We've touched on it a bunch of times and we haven't gotten.
So Parents for Peace is an organization that is fighting radicalization. They help families of loved ones that have been radicalized throughout the US and Canada. It's a nonprofit that started by a family that their son served time in jail because he was radicalized and actually executed a terrorist attack. And
in the United States.
In the United States, yep. In the last year, actually, we got so many calls to our hotline about parents, Jewish and non-Jewish, by the way, who are worried about their kids being radicalized. And what's common to, I would say, almost every single call that we get is there is anti-Semitism aspect to it. So from the far left to the far right of terrorism, what they all have in common is Jew hate. This was very, very interesting to me. So basically, by joining this organization, I feel like I'm also preventing. So it's not just helping the victims, it's preventing the next attack. And what Miriam was telling me, you don't have to fight alone. And that was the first time that someone who is not Jewish is telling me, I'm going to not just stand next to you, I'm going to stand with you and fight with you. And I cherish that. So what I've learned from them is a lot about how radicalization works and how what we're seeing with anti-Semitism, it's really not just a Jewish problem, because we have the effect of how it's affecting us, specifically from pain perspective, but it's also causing radicalization to the non-Jews. So everybody should be on their watch, right? This is not just an education issue. This is a social issue. I mean, as a parent, if you care about your kid not joining Al-Qaeda, you definitely want to be on top of that. So Parents for Peace, we have a former neo-Nazi and a former jihadist who works with us and helping parents and helping people that might have been radicalized.
You're looking at the radicalization of kids. You're looking at the trauma experience of kids. You're looking at the ways in which spaces like our schools where children should feel safe are not being supported and feeling safe. What interventions would you want to see? What interventions do you think can be made by the Commonwealth to support these kids, to make sure that these environments in which children come to learn are safe for all children, to address this issue of the ways in which anti-Semitism and other forms of hate lead to radicalization?
We like to say that our organization or schools are trauma-informed. I think we should check, are they actually trauma-informed? Are they actually meeting the criteria for that? From the physical space to the psychological space, I think checking in with both Israelis and Jewish students will be really important. I think education is key. I think what we're seeing is failed education, or like Senator Wells was saying, this is malpractice of education. The teacher has such an important role in a kid's life, in shaping kids' life. This is where they spend most of their day. If you're seeing a Jewish kid or an Israeli kid, any type of kid having a hard time, it's not a political thing to ask them if they're okay and if they need support. You don't have to get into which side of the conflict you are. You need to make sure they're safe, because if they're not safe, they're not going to be able to function at school. And what are the warning signs of radicalization? Having training around that as well. The trauma-informed schools, there is a lot of research behind it. I would take what's already there from evidence-based perspective and personalize it and add the anti-Semitism, the traumatic invalidation piece to it, to make it very specific to this population, just like we do with any type of minority group. So it's not just a cookie cutter. We're making it specific to the community, but basing it on actual literature.
Thank you for everything that you're doing. Our guest today has been Dr. Miri Bar-Halpern. You know, we call our podcast Leaders Unplugged, and you talk about your journey and the pivot, the change that you've made since October 7th in your work. And I think it's fair to say that you've become, probably always were, a true leader in this work, and really a leader in our community in helping us to understand what we're experiencing and helping others in our Commonwealth to understand that as well. So I just thank you for all of your generosity with your time and your efforts.
Thank you so much for having me.